November 2nd, 1915, Blanche and other like-minded women, they knew that the question of suffrage was going to become a ballot question. Blanche wanted to start off 1915 correctly. She wanted to gather all the local like-minded women together in one place to plot, to plan, to strategize, to ensure that they would get the yes vote on November 2nd, 1915. So Blanche, in all of her wisdom, and she decides to hold a suffragette meeting here at Borderland on January 13th, 1915. She set up the library here at Borderland with all the chairs, moved all the tables in there. But January 13th, Blanche, she wakes up here at Borderland. She looks outside and over a foot of snow had fallen. It had become the snowiest day on record, and she feels defeated, thinking nobody in their right mind is going to come out to a suffrage meeting. Later that day, she looks out the windows again. In the distance, she starts to see women trudging through the snow, foot-deep snow, and it's 1915. There are no automobiles traveling in deep snow. There are no plows plowing the roads like we have today. But on January 13th, 1915, 38 women, they braved the weather, they braved the snow, they came to Borderland. They listened to Blanche speak, all for the cause of equality, for that right to vote, for suffrage.
Thank you all for coming here on such a snowy day. 36 of you have trudged through feet of snow from Brockton, Whitman, Boston, Norwood, and here in Easton. The road to suffrage has been long and rocky, just like the land around us, and I'm sure the fight is far from over. 37 years ago, the first suffragists proposed their plans to Congress. 16 years ago, I looked President McKinley in the eyes and called for suffrage. For 18 long years, I have been working towards this very moment, a vote for the new amendment to guarantee the right to vote for us and our daughters. Soon, the men of Massachusetts will have a choice to make. It is our duty to women across Massachusetts and across the nation to convince them to vote for suffrage. We have gathered here today to strategize and plan how we can galvanize these men to action. This is an issue that all women must solve together, regardless of age, class, or education. The time is right for suffrage. Here in Massachusetts, we are already seeing a push towards allowing women to vote in state elections. My own husband's family has been in favor of suffrage for many years, bringing their views into the Massachusetts political sphere. Many states have already passed laws allowing women to vote, and our time is dawning. So join me today in taking the first steps to full equality and also in welcoming Ms. Park.
I agree wholeheartedly with Blanche. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Maud Wood Park. Ladies and enlightened gentlemen, a vote is approaching in November. Men in 4 states, including Massachusetts, will go to the polls and decide whether to extend the vote to women. Now remember, of course, no woman is allowed to vote in this election. Women in the western states have had the right to vote for years. Think of Winona Pinkham, who moved from Colorado, where she had the right to vote, to Massachusetts, where she does not have the simple right. This nonsense must end. Now, I know there are many women of privilege in this room. In fact, our hostess, Blanche, has been blessed with a beautiful home, a loving husband, Oakes, and 4 precious children. She wants for nothing. But even our dear Mrs. Ames understands that just because her life is easy, others are not as fortunate, and their lives will never change so long as they, and we, are denied the basic right to choose our leaders at the ballot box. I will use an analogy that reminds me of the anti-suffragists. They act like someone who, after enjoying a good breakfast, was approached by a hungry person. Rather than figuring out how to get that one person food, the well-fed person said, "Well, I've had all the food I need." In other words, although some enjoy the rights they need and are well taken care of, we must look more broadly and think about those whose needs aren't met. And how will we change this? We must convince our husbands, our brothers, our fathers, our sons, and our neighbors to vote in November, to give us what they have and have had since the founding of our great country. I often reflect on the model Susan B. Anthony provides us. Through her, it is clear that the path to suffrage is never easy. Enduring criticisms from countless men as well as other women, she kept her head high, pushing for a cause she knew to be right, even at a time it was greatly unpopular. And look how far we've come since then. In Australia and New Zealand, women have gained the right to vote. And in the last election, of the 89% of women on the voting list, 84% showed up to vote. Think of what we would look like in the US, how our government would change if 84% of women voted. Even here in our country, the suffragists have made advancements far beyond Miss Anthony ever believed possible. If you will all direct your attention to the map next to me for a moment. This map shows which states have partial rights to vote, which have full, and which have none. The progress of our movement is shown here in red, white, and blue. As for yesterday's vote in the House of Representatives, the vote on whether to add an amendment to allow women the right to vote, despite the House voting 204 to 174 to reject the amendment, I see it as a gain for suffragists, not a loss. The fact that a vote was held at all is a gain, as it shows progress, regardless of the vote's result. In summation, may I suggest a truth that is self-evident to me. All men and women are created equal and entitled to the same right to vote.
Thank you so much, Maud. I would like to now open the floor for both questions for Ms. Park, as well as discussion on how we can improve our advocacy. Ms. Brown?
All across the country, women have begun marching for suffrage. We too need to join in these demonstrations and continue to march in the streets for suffrage. How can the men ignore us if we are in every corner?
Although you make a good point, we've been marching for decades and they continue to ignore us. Perhaps we have to emulate the Founding Fathers and utilize the freedom of the press to our advantage. I hear talk of some women in Beverly, Massachusetts, who have the idea to publish a whole newspaper dedicated to women's suffrage. Maud has obviously been publishing her work, but perhaps we need to think bigger.
I would argue that we have not been completely ignored. In fact, support for our cause is growing rapidly. Look at the South, where support for suffrage has skyrocketed because of industrialization and the problem it has brought. Women are being faced with problems only the ballot can solve. Working women have become the cornerstone of suffrage, and through their marches and demonstrations, many states have implemented suffrage laws for local elections. We cannot discount these victories marching has brought us.
In regards to your point about Southern women and their struggle with industrialization, I would like to point out that as industrial conditions differ in each state, so too should laws. This is why having the right to vote locally, as well as nationally, is so vital for women, as they must be able to vote for state laws that can improve their lives directly.
Now, while I agree that marching is highly effective, it's high time we try something new and different. We need to remember that the very first National Women's Suffrage Convention was held just a few miles away in Worcester. We have an obligation to those women. Sojourner Truth, Lucy Stone, and others. We need to do something different because we've been using the same tactics for decades with only minor victories.
Keep in mind, it is not just the men we need to convince. The Massachusetts Anti-Suffrage League is full of women who are against the suffrage movement. We need to reach out and enfranchise these women. And beyond just these women who are outwardly against suffrage, there's a large percentage of women who simply do not care about the vote. The last time a vote was taken to gauge public perception about women's suffrage, only 4% of women even voted, despite being allowed to.
You make a good point about the Anti-Suffrage League. My own cousin is a staunch supporter of anti-suffrage, and it is hard to deny the fact that their league is effectively organized. Perhaps we ought to follow their example. They publish pamphlets, newspapers, organize effective publicity campaigns, and host speakers.
So we know we need to increase our publications, our newspapers, and our pamphlets. And we know we need to target more women with our message. For me, this seems like a simple fix. We need to publish targeted materials for other women, whether they be indifferent or opposed.
We are lucky to have such talents around us, from Maud's powerful words to Blanche's political cartoons and illustrations. Together, I don't doubt our ability to make engaging and persuasive publications.
Miss Park, I'm curious why you think so many friends of the Antis claim that women will lose their influence with men if they win the right to vote.
This argument is a favorite of mine. I believe that men should be the hunters and women should be sought. Well, it is said that women can lobby legislators for laws to be passed. I have been on many legislative boards and have never yet appeared before a legislator without being made to feel he was doing me a favor in listening to me, that it was a case of anything to please the ladies. If a legislator appeared before a women's club to explain his intentions regarding legislative acts, we would think the skies were about to fall.
The ability to elect legislators who will push for our causes, rather than try to push legislators who disagree with us to support our causes, is vital. We need to communicate this idea to the antis.
And what should we say to those antis who claim a woman cannot be both a homemaker and a suffragist?
To that argument, I would say, look around you. Today, my own children, Evelyn and Amos, sit among you, listening intently to every word you say. Among us, there are suffragists, who are also homemakers. The two are not mutually exclusive.
What should we say to the argument that ignorant women should not vote? Many argue that most women are not informed enough to vote.
To that, I would argue that many ignorant men vote every election, and yet the democracy survives. Second, it is the un-ignorant women who need the right to vote. We must focus on the majority of women who are not ignorant and would be perfectly capable voters.
I'm interested in everyone's thoughts on the recent protests by the National Women's Trade Union.
For those of you who may not have heard, the union has released resolutions against the rich, privileged women who have banded together to form anti-suffrage leagues. The union says that these rich women do not have to vote if they do not want to, but they should not actively work to deprive other women of the ballot.
It is no secret that we who gather here today are wealthy as those women who the union is protesting against. Ladies, do we realize these resolutions were passed at a national convention of what is the largest organized body of working women in the world? Do we realize these women are passing resolutions against us? That we, in our sheltered homes, if we are engaged in work for the anti-movement, are working against the advancement of these working women? Do we realize that while our wealth may make it possible for us to move away from places where city ordinances are not enforced, there are hundreds of poor women who must remain in these environments? Do we realize that while we may, with our money, secure pure milk for our children, there are hundreds of poor mothers who need the ballot in order to secure for their children the legislation and enforcement of such legislation in order that they may secure good milk for their children?
Hear, hear. Perhaps we are at an advantage then in reaching these wealthy antis. After all, they know nothing of the struggles of ordinary women and thus would be unable to relate to their arguments. But they do occupy the same social spheres as we do. Perhaps that is our job, to speak to these women, to show them how we have a duty to the working women who need the ballot in order to advocate for their causes and aid their struggles.
I heartily concur. I urge you all to keep in mind that these are the difficulties that beset every generation where some of the progressive people seek a way to move forward. It has been the attitudes of certain people in every generation to try and hold back, to refrain from whatever is new. We are engaged in a struggle that has been ongoing since the beginning of history. The women's movement has always existed and has not been simply focused on making women recognized as citizens, but as people.
Now, I do hate to break the planning session, as so many wonderful ideas are being shared. But luncheon is ready up in the parlor, and I don't know about you, but I tend to think better on a full stomach.
So the impetus behind this reenactment was really Catherine Honey. She is in charge of the STEM network in this part of Massachusetts, and she really wanted to help celebrate 2020 being 100 years of celebration of women's suffrage. So she approached me and we started a working group with many amazing organizations locally. And on the first couple meetings that we had this awesome roundtable discussion. That's when we started planning Let's Reenact, the January 13th meeting that Blanche held here. I give a lot of recognition to the Brockton Public Library as well as Oliver Ames High School under Olivia Pierce.
I began sort of brainstorming with the script by doing a lot of research on the women's suffrage movement in Massachusetts and sort of when this meeting took place in the context of other events in women's suffrage history. I then started brainstorming how I wanted the meeting itself to go, how I thought Blanche might have run such a meeting like this. I was able to, thanks to the Brockton Public Library, get access to newspaper articles about the event that were written right after it.
I was able to find 2 articles, one from the Enterprise and one from the Brockton Times. And so we were able to get a list of those who attended the meeting, a lot of women from Brockton and Easton, Whitman, I believe, and of course Blanche.
So I based everything solely off of that. So as much of real historical quotes that I could pull from those newspaper documents, I did. And then where I didn't really know what they said or what was being done at that time, I sort of used my imagination to think, well, what would I have done, or what would people that I know would have done in these situations, and what would have been said. I had help from children's author Kate Kleiss in editing and making sure that things flowed and the story made sense. And then Ed Hands of the Easton Historical Society helped me make sure that all of my historical facts were correct. We actually had a table read where I was able to make more changes, mostly, small grammatical things, lines that didn't quite make sense and didn't quite feel like something that would have been said. And then from there, I sort of refined into a final script.
Blanche Ames was just an amazing woman who had many different talents. She was known to be an artist and an inventor, and she also worked very hard for women's rights.
I think there are so many women like Blanche whose efforts have been lost to history, and I hope that other people will be aware that she's only one of many women who put their lives on the line many times to grant us, to give us this right to vote.
So it's really interesting and important to know that it takes all of us to get things done, and not just to sit back and wait for other people to do it. We have to get involved and have your say. I mean, that's what democracy is all about.
I'm hoping that the students who will come there will also learn about her name, and that then might be inspired to research her, find out about her inventions, that they might realize that it's something that you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You can just be an ordinary girl who likes orchids or likes to play with things and build things and make things, and that maybe that will inspire them to study something and pursue a career in STEM.